It is good to see everyone tonight. Glad we can be together. It's dark outside, but it's light in here. We are going to be continuing our look at tactics. Specifically, as you remember last week, we introduced the idea of a group of tactics that the author of the book we've been going through calls the Columbo tactic, because it is kind of loosely based in a way on the character Columbo in the sense of how he asks questions in his cases. He will be very, how should we say, non-threatening and very inquisitive, but when it really comes down to it, he knows exactly what he's doing. He seems like he's kind of just bumbling around at first, but he really knows exactly what he's doing. He's asking questions to begin to gather information and begin to put things together to force other people to kind of prove where they were on a particular night when someone was murdered or whatever, and ultimately to make a point and solve the case. That's kind of his whole thing as he does this. And although, of course, he's not doing anything related to the gospel or anything like that, that model is actually very similar to the model that we see, as we've already talked about several weeks, with Jesus and how he would use questions. So kind of taking the practical side of things like how Columbo, for example, would do something, combining that with both the practical and the spiritual aspects of how Jesus and others would do that, as we see recorded in the New Testament, we have a series of tactics, if you will, that we can use. We talked about these tactics come down to three questions, at least for the Columbo tactic that he talks about. Three questions that we can memorize, very simple, easy questions that will help us in any conversation if we are willing to both memorize the questions and use them effectively as they are intended. So we're going to talk about the first one of those questions for the next few minutes tonight. We're going to talk about what it is, why it's used, what its purposes are, and we're going to practice a little bit as well as we kind of think about this idea and getting used to this concept. Again, this is probably not something that we're familiar with, at least not in terms of using it in this way in conversations about the gospel and things like that. This isn't typically how most Christians are taught to have these conversations, partially because we're not really taught usually much about having these conversations at all. And that's why we're doing this tonight. At least in my experience, there's not a whole lot of training Christians in general how to have these kind of conversations effectively. So, Columbo 1, we're talking about gathering information. As we mentioned, there are three questions. Each question has a different purpose. The first question's purpose is to gather information. As we begin, I want us to think about something. Let's say you're a truck driver. You are needing to take something from point A to point B. A load of cargo or a bunch of tricycles, I don't care. They load all sorts of things in these trucks, right? You are taking something, you have a load, and you're told what this load is. You need to take it from point A to point B. What's your first step?
Plan your route.
Do what?
Plan your route.
Okay, you need to plan your route. What's the first step in planning your route?
Get a map.
Okay, maybe get a map. When I say point A to point B, what do you need to know in that equation?
Where are you going?
Before that, what do you need to know?
Where you're picking up your load.
You need to know where the load is, right? You need to know where you're starting before you even know where you're going. You need to know both of those things, of course. The problem is, as Christians, whenever we are wanting to have conversations with people who don't know the gospel, or maybe have heard some version of it but don't know what Scripture actually says, do we know, hopefully, where we're trying to go with this person? Hopefully that we know. The problem is we usually don't stop to figure out where point A is. We know where point B is, but I can't bring a load from one place to another if I'm starting a different place from where the load is, right? I've got to start from the same point they are if both of us are actually going to get to point B. Now, granted, I can get from point A to point B if point A is where I am and point B is where I want to get, but they're not going to be with me if they're not also at the same starting point. So I need to find out where their starting point is before I can actually get them there. I want us to think, and Acts 17 comes up a lot in these discussions because I think Acts 17 is honestly one of the best blueprints, if you will, for us as Christians in 21st century America. We're not in an Acts 2 world anymore. You could argue that for a while in America, especially in the South, we were kind of in a world where a lot of people we could assume were familiar with certain basic aspects of Christianity. That is less and less true, even in areas of the country that used to be more like that. We are in more of an Acts 17 world at this point, a world where we can't assume people know anything about the gospel, and even if they've heard something about it, it's probably not very accurate. So let's think about what Paul does as he is in Athens in Acts 17, and he is about to give his presentation. The first statement he gives in his presentation, he says, "As I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God." We've heard this passage many, many times. We know what's going on here, but I want to draw our attention to a specific aspect. First of all, is Paul having a one-on-one conversation here? No, he's not. He's talking to a group of people. He's talking to a group of people all at once. You say, well, Neil, that doesn't work because we're talking about one-on-one conversations here. Well, bear with me for a second. Yes, he is talking to a group of people at once, which means he doesn't have a specific person he can ask, hey, what do you believe? Because he's talking to a group of people who probably believe several variants of different things, right? And yet, what has Paul done before he actually begins his presentation? He's gathered information. He has taken the time to walk around the city and observe. Understand a little bit about the Athenians. Understand a little bit about their mindset, about where they come from. Not where they come from literally or national-wise. Wow, that's not even the right way to say that. But you get the idea. We're talking about where they're coming from in their mindset about the divine. Because it's not a one-on-one conversation, he can't just ask someone, but he's still gathering information. And based on that information, he found point A, which is where he starts to get them a little closer to where they need to be in telling them a little more about what God actually is, or maybe I should say who God actually is, but for them, really it's more of a just what the divine is at all. So we see here in Acts 17 this same model. I go to Acts 17 partially, again, because I think that's a good model for us, also because when it comes to Jesus, a lot of times Jesus already knew because he could see into people's hearts, right? And yet he needed the information to start where he needed to start to actually get people to where they need to be. So we see that throughout both the Gospels and the book of Acts. I want to share a very brief summary of one of these stories that is given to us, one of the conversations that's given to us in the book. The author, at a certain point, is on an airplane. As he is sitting on an airplane, he is seated by another gentleman, and they begin talking, as you sometimes do in airplanes. I guess it's less common nowadays than it used to be, but I mean, hey, if you're stuck there, why not meet a stranger and find out a little bit about someone else's life, right? So he strikes up a conversation with this individual, and at a certain point, I think the man asks something about what the author does or something like that, and the author in some way insinuates or states that he's a Christian, and the man says, well, I'm not a Christian. I don't believe in all that. Now, that's helpful information, right? Okay, this person's not Christian. That means I have an opportunity here because I'm in a conversation with this guy. I have an opportunity to maybe help him at least learn a little more about the gospel. Is that enough to go on to be effective? Just knowing someone's not a Christian. I know that now I have an opportunity, but I don't know how to take that opportunity and run with it yet because I don't know what kind of not a Christian he is. You see, the conversation kept going. Gregory, the author, he had some things that he kind of thought about saying, but he waited. He let the man keep talking. The man went on, he said, yes, I used to be a Christian, but I'm not anymore. Oh. You think that changes how, or what rather would be the most effective approach with this individual? If someone's not a Christian, never been a Christian, knows almost nothing about Christianity, am I going to approach that situation a little bit differently from someone who has been a Christian and fallen away? I don't think that someone who has been a Christian and fallen away is going to take very kindly to me just, going straight into the whole God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son, Jesus died for our sins. He's heard all that. He knows all that. All I'm going to do is be like, yeah, I know that. What do you think I am, an idiot? So that's very important information. And yet Gregory still remained silent and let the man talk, kept on gathering information. Because the next thing the man said was even more important. Yeah, my dad, he says, actually was a preacher. And he and I both have left the church because of how he was treated as a preacher. You think that's important for this conversation? You see, every piece of information he gathers makes a world of difference in how he's going to actually approach once he starts talking himself. And again, he's still probably going to ask questions, and we'll talk about that more in a second, of course. But every piece of information he gathers helps hone in the exact approach that's going to be most effective. It gives him a little bit more information. I'll use another silly example. There's a board game that Liz and I have played recently. One of the aspects of the board game is that one side is trying to find a location. There's this map in front of you, and there's like 32 different places that this one location could be, the other person's base. But you don't know, as the other player, where the base is. You have 32 options, right? And yet there's all sorts of ways, as you continue through the game, that you can get just a little bit more information about where the base isn't. You can eliminate just, okay, well, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that. Kind of like if you've ever played Clue. Well, I know that this isn't the murder weapon. I know the murder didn't take place here. I know it's not this person, right? Kind of the same idea. It was the same thing. We're trying to help people understand the gospel. The more information I get, the more I can eliminate. That's a bad idea. Saying that's not going to help. Saying this is not going to be effective. But unless I'm willing to take the time and have the patience to gather that kind of information, well, I'm very, very likely to stick my foot in my mouth. I think, I can't remember, I think I had shared the story I did last week of me talking with somebody who had been converted to another religion, and I essentially tried to refute a belief that he didn't even have because I hadn't actually asked him if he believed it. I just assumed he did because that's what I read. Same type of thing here. Especially when it comes to gathering information, it is crucial. But I hope, because we should be asking this question, if you're not asking this question, I hope we're asking, not this question, this is the wrong question. We already asked that. What would have happened if he hadn't gathered information first? The question we should be asking though is, how can I gather the right information? I need this information. Not everyone's going to be as forthcoming as the gentleman on the plane. Not everyone's just going to just straight out say, oh yeah, I used to be a Christian, my dad was a preacher who was mistreated by the church. I mean, that's some kind of personal information. Not everyone's going to just give that to you for free without you saying anything or asking any questions. So how can I intentionally gather information that I need to start steering the conversation in the right direction? Well, if you're thinking, well, ask questions, yes, you're exactly right. That's what we've been talking about. But specifically, this is where we come to the first question in the Columbo tactic. This is the question that is designed to gather information. This is the question that you can ask in any conversation, basically in response to anything that is said by the other person, and it will give you more info that you can use to be more effective in talking to the person. Ready for the question? Drum roll, please. No, just kidding. The question is this, Columbo 1. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell you on the front end. Each of the 3 questions we're asking can be modified slightly to fit a situation. But this is the core of the question. What do you mean? What do you mean by what you just said? What do you mean by blank? Depending on what they said, we can fill in the blank there. And there's a lot of things, and we'll talk about, especially as we practice in a moment, how this works. But what do you mean by that? This is a 6-word question. Even if you never learn the other 2 questions we're going to talk about, remember there's 3 questions that are part of the Columbo tactic. Even if you never learn the other 2 questions, I guarantee you, if you get used to asking, what do you mean, instead of just moving forward and starting to talk, if you get used to asking this question in conversations with people, especially conversations where you realize that there is a disagreement on something about God or the Bible or Scripture, whatever the case might be, if you just get used to asking this question, you're going to get so much information that's going to be useful for that conversation. You're going to get so much information, oftentimes, that's going to save you from making really, really bad mistakes in the conversation that'll shut the door to the other person. What do you mean by that? 6 words. Easy to remember. But I'm telling you, if you remember this question, it makes a huge difference. Let's think about why this question works before we get into some practice. First of all, I can avoid, by asking this question, misunderstanding what the person has said. Maybe it sounds like what they've said is crystal clear. They made a statement, they say, oh, I don't know, the sky is blue. Seems like an extremely, or actually, no, let's change it. The sky is green. How about that? Seems like an extremely straightforward statement, albeit kind of silly. But you know what I can do if I ask, what do you mean the sky is green? Well, for one thing, I can avoid misunderstanding them. For example, maybe they're saying that the sky is green because they were looking at the northern lights last time. And that's what they were talking about. And I misunderstood. In fact, they were talking about the sky in general is always green. And I was like, well, you're a little bit delusional. So I avoid misunderstanding. Or maybe I avoid misunderstanding in the sense that maybe they just made a mistake. We'll talk about that in a minute. But ultimately, this helps me make sure I understand exactly where they're coming from. I've shared this before, but I think it's been a while, so I'll bring it up again because it's very, very useful. There is basically a debate club, not like in high school or something. This is like adults, but it's basically what amounts to a debate club. I forget what the thing is called, so forgive me there. But basically, what they do is they have debates to try and it's a means of building critical thinking skills, building conversation skills, kind of almost like Toastmasters, but more of a debate-oriented type thing. Well, in this group, they have a rule in their debates. If someone gets up and presents their point of view in the debate, the person who gets up after them has to first, before they can present their side, restate their opponent's view to their opponent's satisfaction. You know why that's important? Because it's really easy to hear what we want to hear coming out of someone else's mouth, especially, ironically, if we disagree with the other person. That never happens in politics, does it? Have you ever watched, not even just the debates, just conversations in politics? How often do people misunderstand one another, kind of almost intentionally, but not really intentionally? They're listening for anything that sounds bad that they can latch onto with someone they disagree with, and they're going to pounce on it. Well, guess how many times they're actually just misunderstanding what the person actually said, because they didn't stop to listen and clarify. So by asking, what do you mean by what you just said, I can make sure I'm not misunderstanding. Not only not misunderstanding, but not misrepresenting either. I don't ever, in any conversation, really about anything, but especially about God and Scripture, I don't ever want to misrepresent what someone else has said. I don't ever want to put words in their mouth, in other words. I don't ever want to accuse them, even subtly or unintentionally, of something they don't actually believe. This is actually very common, more common, unfortunately, than you might think, in religious conversations, whether it be debates or just one-on-one conversations. Because there's this thing in logic and just in general where an idea implies another idea, right? So, for example, let's take the humorously loaded question. Have you stopped beating your wife? What does that imply if you say yes? You have been beating her, right? What does it imply if you say no? Well, you're still beating her. So it's a lose-lose question. But think about what's happening there. Ultimately, if there is a statement like that that implies something else, you're not only assuming the statement, but you're assuming what's implied. Now let's take it to something more realistic maybe. If someone believes in, let's just throw a doctrine out there. If someone believes in once saved, always saved, We're pretty familiar with that doctrine, just in general in the religious world. We've heard that a lot. Once you are saved, you can't be lost. It's impossible. Anyone know who initially kind of articulated that doctrine? It's been several hundred years ago now. Anybody know? Yeah, it was John Calvin. Now, John Calvin did not only come up with the idea of once saved, always saved. John Calvin came up with a lot of ideas. In fact, his main core set of doctrines, if you will, is sometimes called the tulip because it's kind of a, what is it called, an acrostic? Each one of those letters represents one of his doctrines. So it's like total depravity, unconditional election, blah, 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 blah. And the last one, perseverance of the saints, is what he called it, but that's once saved, always saved, essentially. If you walk up to somebody, they tell you they believe once saved, always saved. They may not use those words, but that's what they believe. You find out that's what they believe, hopefully by gathering information, as we've been talking about, right? They say, I believe, once you're saved, you can't be lost. What happens if I automatically say, oh, so you're a Calvinist? Number one, you shut the door. Very good. Number two, just because they believe in once saved, always saved, does that mean they're a Calvinist? It's interesting. This is really getting into some weeds of church history, which would actually be really fun to study sometime. I might throw that in one of our Sunday night classes sometime once we get done with this. But the Baptist church descends in part from branches of Calvinistic groups. But since those breakoffs over the years, the Baptist church has actually shed some of Calvin's doctrines, but held on to others. So Baptists historically used to believe in all of Calvin's tulip, and now they only believe in a couple of parts of it, like once saved, always saved. But things like original sin, babies being in sin when they're born, those kind of things, almost no Baptists believe that at this point. So if I say, well, you're a Calvinist because you believe in once saved, always saved, that is a classic case of misrepresenting someone. I don't know if they're a Calvinist or not. All they've told me is they believe in once saved, always saved. Even if, and this isn't the case, but even if it was implied by once saved, always saved, that you also have to believe the rest of Calvinism, that doesn't mean they've made that connection. There are a lot of beliefs that imply other beliefs, but people don't understand the implication. They just believe the one thing. They would disagree with the other thing if they realized it, even though the two are actually connected, because they don't actually realize the connection. All that being said, not only do I not want to misunderstand the person, I don't want to put words in their mouth. And it's really easy to do that. And finally, and we kind of alluded to this earlier, I also want to make sure they have an opportunity to clarify what they mean. How many of y'all have said something and not actually meant it? Happens all the time, right? How would you respond if you said something and you worded it the wrong way and it came off in a way that you really didn't intend, and someone immediately pounced on it and started attacking you for what you said, and you didn't even mean it the way you said it? You just slip of the tongue, right?
Open mouth and start foot.
Exactly.
Too late then.
I want to give them the opportunity to clarify their own position. Because maybe what they said that really sounded bad wasn't actually as bad as it sounded. On the other hand, they may double down, and then I know that that's what they believe, and I can go from there. But I want them to make sure, not only that I'm not twisting their words in any way, but that they have the opportunity to correct anything that they've said that they didn't actually believe. So, let's go through some examples so we can see how this works. I want us to kind of practice how this works in real life. We're going to take some statements. Now, someone might not say them exactly this way, but some people would say them exactly this way. But either way, we get the idea of the practice here. What is the question? Columbo 1, what is the question? Tell me.
What do you mean by that?
Everybody, come on, not just Ralph. What do you mean by that? We're practicing learning how to make this part of our vocabulary conversations, okay? So, someone says it is irrational, it's not logical, it's silly, whatever word we want to throw in there, to believe in God. It's not scientific. All those words, however you want to put it. Someone says this to you. What is the basic question you can ask when they start? What do you mean by that? However, let's think about this a little more, because there are variants of that question that we could use to be even more specific. For example, I'll just give you one and then we'll kind of go from there. Instead of just saying, what do you mean by that exactly like that, I could pinpoint part of their statement that I specifically want to understand better. For example, I could say, what do you mean by irrational? Now, I'm not trying to ask that in any kind of threatening way. I want my tone to be very, calm and conversational. But I genuinely want to know, what do they mean irrational? It's irrational to believe in God. Do they mean it's irrational in the sense of you're just an idiot if you believe in God? There's some people who their argument is, religion was created to give the village idiot a job kind of thing, which would imply that I'm an idiot. And I don't like that. But anyway, you get the idea, right? Some people just think religion is just stupid. Just that's all there is to it. Other people are very much into, cause and effect proof science type things, and they have been overwhelmed with supposed evidence that God doesn't exist, because that's the go-to in the scientific community at this point in our culture. And so that's where they're coming from. I don't know exactly what they mean by irrational. So instead of just saying, what do you mean by that? I can replace that with something they've said. What do you mean by irrational? What else? How else could we adjust our question just ever so slightly to fit this specific statement? What else might we want to learn more about what they think in their statement? We said, what do you mean by irrational? How about what do you mean by... Okay, what do you mean by believe? We can take another section of it. What do you mean it's irrational to believe in God? Or maybe, what do you mean by believe in the sense of, what do you think faith is? And again, we're going to be very careful not to word it in a way that sounds like we're trying to ask a gotcha question. We don't want to go there. We don't want to do anything except just genuinely ask, what do you mean believe in God? What is the most common definition of faith out there? Anybody know? Most people define faith as a blind leap in the dark. Not based on evidence, just I'm choosing to think this is true without any reason to. I just leap in the dark, right? That's what most people think faith is. So maybe by asking, what do you mean believe? I'm trying to get a sense for, well, do they think that belief is irrational in itself? Do they think faith in anything is irrational itself? And then, if they respond to that, then I know I can go down the track of, okay, let's talk about what faith is. Faith is something we do every day. I have faith that the seats are blue. Well, no, you know the seats are blue. Well, maybe I'm colorblind, right? There's all sorts of things we could do with that. So irrational, we could go down one route. If we ask, what do you mean by believe? We could go another route. What about, what do you mean by God? What is one of the most common conceptions of God? I'll give you a hint. We're getting close to Christmas. Anybody ever heard the idea that God is Santa Claus for adults? That is one of the most common descriptions by people who don't believe in God to make fun of people who do. If you haven't heard that, you probably will, because again, we are much further towards a Nat 17 society than we used to be. So, what do you mean by God? We just said a lot of people don't really understand much about God nowadays. If all they've ever heard about God is, he's a jolly old man up in space that gives handouts to people when they ask him nicely, I don't believe in that God either. That is an irrational belief, isn't it? That creates some common ground, if that's how they answer, doesn't it? So you see what we've done? We've taken the exact same question, but it's just a little bit tweaked. If we want to, again, we could just ask it just like that. What do you mean by that? Give them some more clarification. Then I might say, what do you mean by what? And then you can say, but you can even just modify it on the front end. What do you mean irrational? What do you mean God? Right? And all of a sudden, they're giving us more information to work with that helps us take the conversation in a productive direction. Not that it wouldn't be productive. Maybe we might, happily land on a direction that's helpful. But by them answering, it gives us more information about how they think so that I can pursue something that resonates with them. Even if it's something they may disagree with me on at this point, I know where their head's at now in a way that I didn't before I asked. Let's do another one. All religions are basically the same. Now we could just ask. Just Liz, come on, guys. I know it's dark out, but it's not that late. All religions are basically the same. We could ask, what do you mean by that? How can we modify it even a little bit more specifically?
Why do you think that was?
Okay. Well, what do you mean they are all the same? Why do you think they're all the same? What does that? I wouldn't do it like this, by the way. I'm doing this to kind of help us work through the process. What does it mean they're all the same? For example, some people say all religions are basically the same in the sense that, it's all, how shall I put this? Imaginations of those who don't want to deal with reality. That's one way people might say that religions are all the same. Others might say, well, all religions teach love. And so all religions are basically the same. So a couple different ways.
Jesus, you're going to go there anyway.
Yeah. Maybe not even all religions are the same. Maybe they might say all denominations are the same, right? As long as you believe in Jesus, you're good. So if we hone in on all religions, or if we hone in on all the same, well, now we learn a little bit more about exactly where they're coming from. Or we could ask, what do you mean by all religions? Like Ralph said, are we talking if you believe in Jesus, you're saved? Or are we talking if you believe in any divine being, as long as you believe in love, then you're saved? Kind of an idea. Again, we can kind of nail this down a little bit more. Let's go to another one. The Bible was only written by men. How might we phrase that? Of course, we could just ask, what do you mean? What do you mean by that statement? But how might we even tweak it a little more?
Do you mean just Mayor Mila or somebody that had authority from God to write?
Okay. You said the Bible was only written by men. What do you mean only by men? Are you saying that the Bible was written only by men? Again, I'm not trying to put words in their mouth. I'm just saying, what do you mean by only men? We could even chase that down a little bit more. He does this in one of his examples in the book. Do you have any books? How many of them were not written by human beings? Well, since it was written by human being, whatever books you have, does that mean they're bad? Right? That's one direction we could go. What else? How else could we adjust it? What do you mean by what? Okay. What do you mean by written? It was only written by men. What do you mean it was only written by men? You mean, what process do you think happened to create the Bible? There's a lot of people, for example, who genuinely don't know anything about the history of the Bible. A lot of people genuinely think there was like one or two guys that just sat down and wrote the entire Bible. I'm not kidding. There's that level of ignorance out there in many places. And I'm not saying ignorance to insult anyone. It's just the way it is. Let's do another one. You shouldn't force your morals on others. Now we could ask, but how can we even modify it a little more? Not saying just asking the question is wrong. Again, if you just say those 6 words exactly, you're still going to be in a great place to continue the conversation forward. But if you want to be a little more specific, what could you say? What do you mean by morals? What do you mean by morals? You see, morals simply mean something that's right and wrong. If you don't believe you should force your morals on anyone, well, are you just talking about like religious morals? Or are you talking about all morals? In which case, which morals are okay to force on people and which aren't? Because all of a sudden you made a distinction. So we can go, what do you mean by morals? What else? What do you mean by force? I mean, after all, when we're talking about Christians don't force their morals on others. Now, if we want to go maybe to like the history of like what do you call it? imperial papacy or whatever, meaning the Catholic Church when it was a political institution that governed land, okay, maybe we could talk. But in terms of Christianity as it exists in America, we don't force. So what do you mean by force? Do you mean we say either you do this or you're going to hell? Or do you mean force as in, for example, when we go to vote on Tuesday, you're trying to force your moral opinion on others? Well, in that case, I mean, you're thinking that we shouldn't force our morals, but isn't the very question or the very statement, you shouldn't force your morals, a moral statement? According to my morals, you shouldn't force your morals. Well, wait, right? So, what do you mean by force? What do you mean by morals? Very good. Let's go through a couple more and we'll wrap up for tonight. But I want us to really get our minds working on how this works in any conversation. Don't you believe in evolution? Science has proven evolution. Don't you believe in evolution? We could ask, what do you mean by that? But even more specifically, what can we ask? What do you mean by evolution? Most people aren't aware there's two different kinds of evolution. There is evolution in the sense that dogs can be either Maltipoos or Poodles or Maltese or Great Danes or German Shepherds. That's actually a form of evolution. Or we could be talking about you went from a bacteria to a dinosaur. That's also evolution. So what do you mean by evolution? I do believe in evolution, depending on how we define it. I don't believe in evolution in the sense that it took, 4 billion years for us to get from a rock floating through space to what we have now. How can you explain all the evil in the world? This is one they try and trip us up on as Christians. And in fact, if you don't know how to process it, I think that it is one of the hardest questions to answer until you really start piecing it together. So we could ask, what do you mean by that? But what specifically could we hone in on?
What is evil?
What do you mean by evil? Because here's the problem. If you're talking to someone who doesn't believe in God, they don't have, whether they realize it or not, they don't have an actual standard that defines good and evil. So instead of, and this goes back to what we've been talking about this whole time, instead of going on the defensive, which is what they're trying to do with this question usually, instead of letting them put you on the defensive, get you on the back foot, what do you mean by evil? Now they've got to define what evil is without God. You think that's going to be an easy job? Now, eventually, we can answer their question. How can God allow evil in the world and all those kind of things? We can answer that question eventually. But for right now, let's not go there. They're the ones who made the statement, or asked the question in this case. We're answering a question with a question because they're the ones who bring it up. This question has a purpose. We are essentially sucking out that purpose and making them reevaluate their question. A couple more. Do you actually take the Bible literally? We can ask, what do you mean by that? But even more specifically, we could ask, what do you mean by literally? Now, there are a lot of people who will die on the hill of, yes, we must take the Bible literally. We just got done studying Revelation not too long ago. What was one of the things we talked about? This isn't meant to be taken literally. And yet at the same time, the whole Bible is meant to be taken literally if we mean the whole Bible is meant to be taken as truth. But people don't usually have that level of nuance when they ask a question like this. They're trying to trip us up. So what do you mean by literally? Now they have to define it. Fetus is human, but it's not a person. That's actually an argument people make now. Used to, it would be a fetus is neither human nor a person, it's just a clump of cells. Now, at least they admit sometimes that it's human, but still not a person. It's just a potential human, something like that. What do you mean by human? How is it human but not a person? Let them define it. You're not obligated to define any of this. They're the one that made the statement. Make them define their statement. What do you mean by human? What do you mean by person? What's the difference? Don't ask it as a gotcha question. Don't in any way come off as, oh, you silly, I'm going to trip you up right here. Don't do that. Genuinely ask. You're trying to get more information so you can be more effective in your conversation with this person. So just ask, what do you mean? What do you mean by a fetus, even? That's also a fair question. There's all sorts of definitions for that nowadays. Some people are defining fetus this way, defining fetus that way, right? So all these questions, statements, challenges that are brought up, if you start off just trying to get more information, you're making them do the work. You're making sure you don't misunderstand, mischaracterize, misconstrue what they've said. You're giving them a chance to clarify in case they made a mistake. And you are setting yourself up to have more to go on once you move forward with the conversation, because you know more about where they're coming from now. And you've already forced them to be the ones to have to back up what they're saying and think it through. When you're confronted with a challenging idea, this is 6 words, y'all. This, especially since it's Sunday night, right? Next week, as Ray said, we'll be gone. So you got 2 weeks before our next question that we'll talk about. For the next 2 weeks, when you get a chance, when someone makes a statement, even if it's just, right, you and your spouse just having fun with it, right? Ask, what do you mean by that? If you get into a fight with somebody, what do you mean by that? If someone says, how dare you vote for this person? What do you mean by that, right? Practice. Get used to using this type of conversation. And I guarantee you, if this becomes a normal part of your vocabulary, it's going to change the way your conversations go, and it's going to change how effective you can be in those conversations when you start talking about things that really matter. Any last thoughts before we close for this evening? As always, the invitation of the Lord is open. If there's anything we can do to encourage or help you, please let us know as we stand and sing.
When Jesus comes
To reward his servants, whether it be new